In this unit, we're discussing the Civil War in Arkansas and the arguments behind it. So as you can probably imagine, with something as big as the Civil War, there wasn't just one cause, there were several arguments that kind of led up to the start of the Civil War. Those four arguments were states' rights, economy, social hierarchy, and a politically divided country in general. So as far as states' rights go, we're talking about sovereignty, the idea that states can make their own decisions about how their people want to live. In this case, Arkansas was a slave state, and the people who believed in states' rights felt like they should be able to choose slavery as a state. Largely, that was also because the economy of Arkansas was based on slave labor at that time. So not everyone in Arkansas had plantations or cotton plantations or any kind of plantation for that matter, but those who did were very wealthy. And those who were very wealthy and had those plantations had a lot of slaves. Those who didn't have a lot of slaves, like we talked about in the last unit, maybe those who had slaves to help farm, or who had slaves as household servants, that was also still part of the economy. It was also part of social hierarchy. So especially when you start looking in terms of the living conditions of slaves and that sort of thing, the living conditions of the household servants that were in the more populated city areas, although we know that most of Arkansas slaves were largely in rural areas or plantation-style settings, but there was very much a social hierarchy, and honestly, it was based on skin color. So today in America, we look at kind of a class situation, and we would say maybe we have three classes. We have upper, middle, and lower class as far as economy goes. But at this particular point, there were upper class, middle class, lower class, and then there were slaves. So even if you were the poorest of the white people, there was still someone below you in terms of social hierarchy. So even if poor people didn't have slaves, they still benefited from slavery in that social hierarchy kind of way. One of the things that I find as people start to do genealogy research is they say, oh, my people were poor, we didn't own slaves. Well, maybe not. But you know, if you were the poorest of poor and still white, then you kind of benefited from the social hierarchy of the time. Or you didn't, but your family did. So, also a very politically divided country at the time. We had people who were very much into human rights and people who were very much into states' rights / economy. People who wanted to hang on to that social hierarchy. So all of those four arguments kind of work together, or individually, depending on who you asked, to cause the American Civil War. So I don't know that there's one main cause. If you were to ask me what caused the Civil War, I would say slavery. Because if you look back at these four causes, these four main arguments, then you can kind of tie those all to slavery. Like it was the states' rights to keep slavery, it was an economy based on slavery, a social hierarchy that benefited from slavery, and a country that was politically divided over an issue, and that issue was slavery. So I'm not going to tell you that that was the cause of the Civil War. I think that that's something you should look at and determine for yourself. But if someone were to ask me what it was, I'd say slavery, and I would list those reasons. But anyway, the four main arguments of the Civil War: states' rights, economy, social hierarchy, and a politically divided country. You can still talk to people today who will argue this. There are people who will not say that slavery had anything, or who will say that slavery had nothing to do with the Civil War. But they'll always come back to states' rights or sovereignty or something like that. But to me, it's really hard to pull slavery out of that argument as well. So, in order for us to really understand how one state could possibly secede from the Union, we have to jump back a little bit into U.S. history to talk about something proposed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison in 1798. They proposed the idea of nullification. And nullification just means voiding out something. It's the act of voiding something. So Jefferson and Madison proposed a way that states could void a federal law. It was actually a protest by Virginia and Kentucky against the Federalists' Alien and Sedition Acts. So these Alien and Sedition Acts kind of worked together to make it harder for immigrants to vote. It allowed the president to deport some immigrants. It prohibited public opposition to the government, which sounds like a whole lot of not free speech, but very much controlled speech, which was also part of the no writing, no printing, no saying or publishing anything false, scandalous, or malicious. So pretty much you couldn't say anything against the government, and they could decide what they thought was false or scandalous too. So this was something that Jefferson and Madison, on the heels of the American Revolution, see as a very dangerous kind of thing happening in the Alien and Sedition Acts. Also, for their public opinion writing in newspaper editorials, several newspaper editors were arrested. More than 20 of them were arrested for printing their public opinions about about anything related to the government. So, again, for Jefferson and Madison, that was a red flag after the Revolutionary War, which, part of our rights that were established in the Constitution include free speech and free press. And the Alien and Sedition Acts would take those things away. Their argument here was that the national government was an agreement, a compact, between states. And if states felt like the national government infringed on their rights, that the federal rule was not valid then. Because it takes the states to make the national government, if you're kind of following along here. So in this, the whole idea that you can't have a national government without all of our states together, that placed the states' rights above the federal. And this was the precedent that was used to justify secession when the Confederacy was developed. So, the idea of nullification started with Jefferson and Madison in 1798. It continues 1832 in South Carolina, when South Carolina passes the Ordinance of Nullification. South Carolina is just really mad because the federal government has tried to pass a tariff that will have great impact on South Carolina. South Carolina gets so mad that the state threatens to secede if the federal government tries to enforce this tariff. President Andrew Jackson doesn't want to be pushed around, so he asked Congress for authority to use force, if needed, to collect this tariff from South Carolina, and Congress does pass the force bill. But at the same time, Congress also passes a bill that drops that tariff that South Carolina was so mad about. So in a way, it should be that everyone's happy. I mean, Congress ends the tariff, South Carolina was mad about the tariff, so it should be all good. In that regard, South Carolina decides to rescind its nullification of the tariff because, Congress voided out the whole idea of the tariff to begin with. But, just to make a point, South Carolina nullifies the force bill. Not that it's being used, but just because they want to make a point that they're not going to stand for it, that they have doubled down into this idea of nullification, and with their ordinance of nullification as part of their state, then they show the government that they're going to use it, which also sets forth the idea of secession later, because nullification is kind of what leads the states to be able to do that. They base their secession on the idea of states' rights, which was formed in the whole process of nullification. And I left another note here on the bottom of your slide, very small, pretty much for me as a reminder. And I want to point out that the third attempt at nullification in U.S. history actually came in 1957 in Arkansas, when Governor Orville Faubus tried to nullify the Brown versus the Board of Education decision, which declared that schools could not be separate but equal, because separate but equal did not exist, that schools should be desegregated immediately. So this whole tariff and nullification business really kind of sets the North against the South. It also develops the idea of industrialization versus agriculture, because most of the South, still using slave labor, is based on an agricultural economy. But the northern states are becoming more and more industrialized. It also creates the idea of union versus secession. So that's about to come up, and state versus federal. So the consequences of tariffs and nullification really kind of start to show the separate degrees between North and South in our country. Now, when Arkansas had to make the decision of whether or not to leave the Union, it first voted not to secede. It didn't vote to secede until Lincoln calls the states and says, hey, we need you to send troops to fight for the Union. At that point, the Arkansas legislators take a step back and say, okay, initially we wanted to stay out of the Civil War. We didn't want to deal with this. Now the president is asking us to fight for the Union, and we're a slave state. So in order to protect slavery at that point, Arkansas had another secession convention and did vote to join the Confederacy. So Southern Democrats accepted the doctrine of nullification that was introduced in the Hartford Convention in 1814 and 1815, and this process of nullification gave states the right to void any federal law that they just didn't like in their state. Remember, South Carolina used it for those tariffs. So that is the whole states' right argument. So looking back at the economy argument, slavery was legal in all colonies at the time of the Revolutionary War. But the Quakers, as we talked about in the past, were among the very first to actively seek to end slavery on a large scale, because the Quakers in Pennsylvania were noticing these slave ships coming in, and Quakers built their religion on the idea of equality, and slavery, they see very quickly, does not agree with that religious belief of equality. So they start pushing to end slavery right away. In 1790, a proposal was submitted to Congress to end slavery. Of course, it goes nowhere. But the North's economy was based on industry, which brought European immigrants. So these immigrants are being hired for very low wages. So there's not really a need for slaves in the North, because they have a workforce that doesn't require very high pay. The South has these sprawling farms and large plantations that were really dependent on slave labor. There was not a lot of mechanized technology at the time. Now, Eli Whitney did invent the cotton gin in 1793, and he thought that it would help bring slavery to a close. However, it actually called for an increase in slave labor. So before the cotton gin, slaves would have to pick the seeds out of these pieces of cotton. And the cotton gin does that. I mean, it's a little machine that's made to shake the seeds out of cotton. So he thought that that might call an end to slave labor. But there was more labor needed to pick more cotton because the cotton gin actually made cotton production much, much faster. So now slave labor is on the increase, and cotton is referred to as king cotton because it is the South's #1 crop economy. We've already had a unit based specifically on slavery, so we won't go into it too much again here, except just to mention these few statistics that by 1860, 1/4 of the state's population was slave. So I wanted to bring up something here about a local community. Many of you may have heard of Tulip, Arkansas. It is located just past Malvern on Highway 9, before you get to Leola or Carthage or some of the other Highway 9 towns. So Tulip is hardly anything now. It's a very, very small community. But from 1842 to 1862, this 2-decade period, this was the center of higher education in Arkansas. It was actually referred to as the Athens of Arkansas, known as a center of knowledge. So I just blows my mind because I know where Tulip is. I've driven through Tulip. If you ever have time to get out and drive around, take Highway 9, scenic Highway 9, and drive through Tulip. In Tulip, there was a female college seminary in 1858. It was known as the Ouachita Conference Female College, but it stopped in 1861 when the staff had to go away for war. After the Civil War, there were schools for African Americans that were there. Scipio Jones is one of the students who attended school in Tulip. Scipio Jones becomes a famous state lawyer who defends 12 men sentenced in the Elaine Massacre of 1919. And he is a Republican. He's an African American lawyer. And there is a movie coming out about Scipio Jones at some point. It's in the works, and I cannot wait for it. Scipio Jones was born to a slave and was fathered by her master. So when Tulip kind of fell because of the Civil War. The homes were burned during the Jenkins Ferry battle, and a lot of people from Tulip actually moved to Malvern in order to kind of set up there, which is when the Malvern community started to build up. The social ramifications of slavery were very different too. So we talked about how there was a social hierarchy where it was rich, middle class, poor, and then slaves. But even that has a breakdown because the physical appearance of skin color broke that hierarchy down even a little more. So we have the rich white people at the top of the social ladder, the middle class white people in the middle, the lower class white people at the bottom of that part of the social ladder. But then, in terms of slaves or even African Americans after the Civil War, we had lighter skin African Americans were accepted a little better. The conditions were still bad, but lighter skinned black people had better acceptance, and then kind of a medium darker skin down to the darkest skin. So the physical appearance that was made obvious by the racial difference created this set of othering that, you know, that created the social hierarchy based technically not just on skin color but on skin tint as well. This was perpetuated for a long time. Even in the 1920s, the Cotton Club in New York City hired a lot of African American performers, but those performers were not allowed to be customers in the club, and all of them were light-skinned. So because light-skinned African Americans were socially accepted at that time period. Um, Slaves were often seen as outsiders, and they had been taken unwillingly from one culture and forced into another. Sometimes, most times, at the in the era that we're talking about, slaves were thought to be lazy or cowardly or childlike, which fed to the idea of paternalism. Paternalism means that there must be some man who takes control and takes care of everyone. Paternalism, paternity, like dad, so that's where the word comes from. But the idea that there must be some overall dad figure to take care of everyone who obviously can't take care of themselves. And this also justified to many people, many white people, the idea of slavery because, these people needed to be taken care of, and they were doing these slaves a favor by taking care of them in their minds. Now, I feel like it's a good point to remind everyone that not everyone in Arkansas had slaves, and not everyone across the Confederacy had slaves. There were poor people who did not have slaves. There were people who did not believe in slavery within the Confederacy. But when we talk about these ideas, like this idea of paternalism and that sort of thing, that was kind of the large overarching belief system that was in place at the time period. So when I first heard the term Jim Crow laws, when I was much, much younger, I thought, wow, this Jim Crow must have been some guy, some slave who led a slave rebellion or something like that. But that's not the case. The term Jim Crow laws, this actually came from a minstrel character named Jim Crow. He was a white guy who wore blackface back when it was accepted as entertainment, and he sang a song called Jumpin' Jim Crow. In Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, that's when we see that the federal government really kind of gives a big thumbs up to Jim Crow laws, this idea of separate but equal. So in 1896, we're well past the Civil War and well past the idea of slavery, but we're still not integrated at this point. So Plessy versus Ferguson was a case in Louisiana where an African American man wanted to ride in a car. It was a white rail car, but they told him he had to ride in the black rail car. The Supreme Court said, we don't see any harm in this as long as you're getting where you're going and it's separate but equal. So, the federal government establishes this as kind of a separate but equal kind of theme in our society. Arkansas really didn't jump into Jim Crow laws right away, and part of that is because of Reconstruction, which we'll talk more about soon, but the Jim Crow laws didn't start until several years even after Reconstruction, and that was with a Streetcar Segregation Act. In 1921, in Arkansas, there was the Forbidden Interracial Cohabitation Law that did not let you cohabitate, did not let you live with anyone. If you were white, you couldn't live with anyone with any kind of single drop of African American blood. So these laws start coming into play. And 1921, interestingly, also is around the time that the Klan starts making a resurgence throughout the South. And we will talk about that more in Reconstruction too. Again, these Jim Crow laws, while they weren't initially kicked into gear right after the Civil War, they lasted for a long time. In 1937, racetracks and gambling were segregated in the state. In 1947, Polling places were segregated, prisons, washrooms. There were stricter penalties for transportation that didn't have segregated facilities, and interracial marriage and sex was illegal with really harsh penalties, and segregated schools continued. Um, and of course, we know about the Little Rock Nine. So, when Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas was decided by the Supreme Court in 1954, which allowed African American students to go to the students with, to go to the schools with white students. That didn't happen right away. Neither did the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So these laws were passed, but they didn't end the practice, especially in the South. In terms of the politically divided country aspect of the Civil War, the Republicans, as you know, were in the North, the Democrats were in the South. Now, that's not to say that there weren't some Democrats in the North and some Republicans in the South. But generally speaking, this map depicts Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. Now, I would like to call your attention to a breakdown in the Democratic Party, though. We have Stephen A. Douglas, the Democrat, but we have John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrat. And Breckinridge clearly won the states that would end up falling into the Confederacy, with 72 electoral votes compared to Stephen Douglas's 12. So slavery is very much a dividing issue at this point in the 1860 election. And it's hard to separate that out when you start talking about causes of the war.